ninth graders. We're continuing our read of Into the Clouds, and we just finished a section where Molinar is reflecting on another climber who climbed Annapurna, and his last name was Herzog, and he was reflecting on what that climber was willing to do to reach the summit. And he did reach the summit, but as a result of reaching the summit and the temperatures, he had extreme frostbite of his hands and his feet. They turned to blocks of ice. And so ultimately all of his fingers and toes were amputated. And he wrote a book that became a best-selling book of his experience. At the same time, he lost his fingers, all of his fingers and all of his toes, which changed his life. He never climbed again. And so Molinar is reflecting on how far is he willing to push himself. And he's writing in his diary that he's not willing to he's not going to do that. He's not willing to go to that extent. But anyway, this is a picture of Herzog, the one who did climb Annapurna, and in the process lost his fingers and toes. And so this is where we kind of pick up with D. Molinar on his expedition with the others to K2 and reflecting on how far he really is willing to climb. By the afternoon of July 30th, Houston was feeling desperate. It had been nearly 10 days since they established Camp 6. Getting 8 men up the mountain had begun to seem like an impossible task. He stood with the rest of the team at the base of the ice slope above the Black Pyramid, huddled in his parka against the wind. Schoenig and Gilkey had spent the day searching the slope for a Camp 7 site. All they needed was a piece of ground big enough for 3 tents and level enough to keep them all from sliding down the mountain in the middle of the night. K2 had given them nothing. Schoenig and Gilkey didn't care. They had gotten this far. They weren't going back. They found a soft spot in the snow and hacked at it with their ice axes until they had the narrowest of platforms. Well, this page wants to stick together, I think. The narrowest of platforms carved into the slope. It was 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. Now you think about that, 6 feet long. I'm almost 6 feet tall, I'm not, but I'm almost. So my height and 1 yard, which is really the length of your arm. If you go from your shoulder to the tip of your finger, that's 3 feet. So they spent their whole day, and that's what they carved. For 3 tents, see what happens. It was 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, barely big enough for 2 men to sleep side by side. But for the 2 youngest members of the team, that was enough. They would spend the night there and resume the search for Camp 7 in the morning. Houston didn't like it, neither did Molinar. It was bitter cold, and the tiny platform offered no protection from the wind. A 600-foot incline, dangerously steep, loomed above the camp. If fresh snow fell during the night, there was no guarantee the slope would hold it. This was the avalanche slope that had terrified Cy Tendrip in 1939, and the slope where his friends were probably swept to their deaths. But Houston knew they were running out of choices, and Schoenig and Gilkey were a force. All the way up the mountain, Schoenig had been the first one out the tent door, even in the worst weather. Gilkey was almost as young and even more eager. According to Molinar, he wanted the summit at all cost. Houston reluctantly agreed that the 2 men should just stay just for a night. He and the rest of the team left a radio set in the tiny tent, dumped their loads just below the camp, and headed down the mountain. Shonik and Gilkey cram themselves into the tent. Charlie is like a mother and is worried about me and Art, Shonik scribbled in his diary. Then he tried to sleep. The next day dawned cold and windy at Camp 6. New snow blanketed the mountain, and everyone woke worried about Shonik and Gilkey. Strather and Molinar made a trip to Camp 5 to bring up 2 more loads of food. In the afternoon, they piled into the large Army expedition tent and told stories to pass the time. Late in the afternoon, the radio crackled to life and everyone gathered around. Shonik and Gilkey announced from their cramped tent that they were cold but alive and well. They had spent the day combing the ice slope, bundled into every piece of clothing they had. The climbing was slow and treacherous. For an hour at a time, Gilkey had shivered in place, belaying while Shonik kicked or chopped steps in the slope. Then Gilkey would follow and take the lead for an hour. At almost 25,000 feet, cutting steps it was grueling work, but at least it kept the blood flowing. Standing in one place, paying out rope, you felt like you could freeze into the slope. A serac made from human flesh. All morning they had traversed the slope, searching for the camp where Wolf had spent his last days. Finally, they decided it had been swept away by an avalanche. They retraced their steps to the tiny ledge and headed straight up the mountain. For 150 feet, they chopped steps in the ice. The crusty ice turned to snow, and they made their way cautiously for another 400 feet. With each step, they sank to their knees, half expecting the mass of powder to give way and pull them tumbling down the mountainside. By mid-afternoon, the ground leveled off, and they emerged onto a broad, gently sloping shoulder. Not since the lowest camps had the mountain given them this kind of space. To Shonik, it felt like a breakthrough. They had taken the worst K2 had to offer and passed the test. Shonik and Gilkey picked a campsite that was out of avalanche danger. They dumped 20-pound loads and climbed down to their tent, where they had left the radio set. They hadn't found Weisner's Camp 7, Shonik told Houston, but they had discovered something better, a site for Camp 8. From there, Shonik couldn't quite see the summit, but he was convinced they would get there. All they needed were 3 good days. So this is a picture of Camp 6 and clinging to the side of the mountain below the Black Pyramid. That's where they're sleeping. It's beyond amazing. And we will begin on page 174. It sounds like they may not get 3 good days because chapter 15 is In the Eye of the Storm. Thanks so much, 9th grade. Enjoyed this and look forward to reading next time. Take care. Bye now.